In the frozen heart of Yakutia, where breath turns to ice before it hits the ground, an ancient enemy appeared at Agafia's door. But this wasn't a predator seeking blood. It was a desperate mother begging for life. What happened that night defied the laws of nature and forged a bond that would echo through the tundra forever. To understand this story, you have to understand the cold. We are not talking about a chilly winter morning in New York or London. We are talking about Oymyakon, a remote village in the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia. Here, the temperature frequently drops below -60 degrees Celsius. Locals call it the Pole of Cold. It is a place where car engines must run 24 hours a day to keep from freezing solid, and where the silence is so heavy it feels like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums. Living in this white void was Agafia Petrovna. At 72 years old, Agafia was as tough as the larch trees that dotted the landscape. She was a widow, her husband Nikolai having passed away a decade prior during a particularly brutal blizzard that cut off the roads to the nearest hospital. Since then, Agafia had lived alone in her timber cabin on the outskirts of the village, separated from her nearest neighbor, a mechanic named Victor, by 3 miles of dense snow and taiga forest. Agafia was not a woman prone to sentimentality. You couldn't be. Not out here. She chopped her own wood, hunted for hare, and maintained a deep, respectful fear of the wild. Specifically, the wolves. In Yakutia, wolves are not the romanticized spirits of the forest often seen in movies. They are apex predators. They are competition. Years ago, a pack had slaughtered Agafia's 2 goats, leaving nothing but blood on the snow. She kept a loaded Mosin Nagant rifle by her door, a relic from the war, and she knew how to use it. It was late January, the time of the whispering stars, a phenomenon where the moisture in your exhaled breath freezes instantly with a crackling sound like shuffling cards. It was 3 p.m., and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a bruised, purple twilight. Agafia was finishing her evening chores, securing the heavy shutters over her windows. The wind was picking up, howling like a banshee, promising a storm that would bury anything left outside. Just as she reached for the heavy iron latch of her front door, she heard it. It wasn't a howl. It wasn't a growl. It was a whine, high-pitched, broken, and filled with pain. Agafia froze. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against the doorframe. The sound came again, closer this time, from the edge of the clearing where the forest met her yard. Squinting through the gloom, she saw a shape detach itself from the shadows. It was massive, gray and silver, moving with a staggering, drunken gait. A wolf. And not just any wolf, but a timber wolf of immense size, the kind that led packs and took down elk. "Get back!" Agafia shouted, her voice raspy. She raised the rifle, the heavy wood stock cold against her cheek. "I will shoot. Go!" Usually, a wolf would vanish at the sound of a human voice, melting back into the tree line. But this one didn't. It took another step forward, its legs trembling violently. Then, it collapsed. It didn't fall like an animal attacking. It fell like a building crumbling. It hit the snow with a dull thud and didn't move. Agafia stood there for a long minute, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was it a trap? Wolves were intelligent. Was the rest of the pack waiting in the tree line? She scanned the forest edge. Nothing, just the whistling wind and the biting cold. Curiosity, that dangerous thing, tugged at her. Keeping the rifle trained on the beast, she took a cautious step off her porch. The snow crunched loudly under her felt boots. "Hey!" she yelled again. The wolf lifted its head. The movement was agonizingly slow. Its eyes, glowing gold in the fading light, locked onto hers. There was no aggression in them. There was only a profound, terrifying clarity. As Agafia got closer, the adrenaline in her veins turned to ice. She saw why the animal had collapsed. The wolf's belly was distended, swollen tight against its ribs. It was heavily pregnant. And looking at the dark, wet stain spreading beneath its hindquarters, Agafia realized something else. The wolf was in labor, and she was dying. The creature let out a low, gurgling whimper, and laid her head back down on the ice. She looked at Agafia, then at her swollen belly, then back at Agafia. It was a look that transcended species. It was a look that every mother knows. It was a plea. "Help me." Agafia Petrovna looked at the rifle in her hands. She thought about her goats. She thought about the danger. If this wolf recovered, it could kill her in seconds. But then she looked at the thermometer nailed to the porch post. It read -52 degrees Celsius. If she left the animal here, the mother and the pups would be frozen solid within 20 minutes. "You foolish old woman," Agafia whispered to herself, a curse she often used when her late husband Nikolai did something reckless. She slung the rifle over her shoulder. She bent down, grabbing the wolf by its front paws. The animal weighed at least 50 kilograms, pure muscle and fur. Agafia gritted her teeth, summoned the strength of a lifetime of hard labor, and began to drag the enemy into her home. Getting the wolf inside was a battle against physics and gravity. Agafia had to use an old canvas tarp she used for hauling wood. She rolled the semi-conscious beast onto it and, inch by agonizing inch, pulled it up the 3 wooden steps of her porch. When she finally kicked the heavy door shut and slid the deadbolt, the silence of the cabin returned, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The smell of pine and wood smoke was instantly overpowered by the scent of wet fur, musk, and the metallic tang of blood. Agafia dragged the tarp near the cast-iron stove that dominated the center of the room. The heat here was intense, a stark contrast to the freezing hell outside. The wolf was panting shallowly, her tongue lolling out. Up close, Agafia could see the scars of a life lived in the wild, a notch missing from her left ear, a long, healed slash across her shoulder. This was a warrior, but right now, she was just a frightened animal in pain. Agafia removed her heavy coat and rolled up her wool sleeves. She wasn't a vet, but she had been a midwife's assistant in the village 40 years ago, and she had helped deliver countless calves and lambs on the farm. Mammals were mammals. The mechanics of birth were largely the same. She knelt beside the wolf. "All right, Mama," she murmured, her voice steady. The wolf didn't growl. She was too weak. She flinched when Agafia's hand touched her swollen abdomen. But she didn't snap. Agafia felt the stomach. It was rock hard. The contractions were coming in rapid, chaotic waves, but nothing was happening. The wolf groaned, a sound so human it made the hair on Agafia's arms stand up. "You're stuck," Agafia diagnosed, her brow furrowing. "One of them is turned wrong." She moved to the rear of the animal. The situation was critical. A pup was breached, blocking the birth canal. If it didn't move, the wolf's uterus would rupture, or she would die of exhaustion and infection. Agafia stood up and fetched a basin of hot water from the stove, a bar of harsh lye soap, and her bottle of vodka usually reserved for visitors like Victor or the rare postman. She poured the vodka over her hands and arms to disinfect them. The fumes filled the small cabin. "I am going to hurt you," Agafia told the wolf, looking directly into those golden eyes. "If you bite me, I will leave you to die. Do you understand?" The wolf stared back, slowly, deliberately. The animal closed her eyes and exhaled. It was a surrender, a permission. Agafia went to work. She had to reach inside. It was messy, dangerous work. The wolf's body seized up in agony. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the wolf's chest, shaking the floorboards. But her jaws remained clamped shut. The level of self-control the animal possessed was terrifying. She knew Agafia was helping. She knew. Almost. Agafia grunted, sweat stinging her eyes. She could feel the small, slippery legs of the pup. "Come on, little one." With a sickening squelch and a heave of effort from the exhausted mother, the blockage cleared. Agafia pulled the first pup out. It was stillborn, a small, gray, limp thing. Agafia set it aside quickly on a towel. There was no time to mourn. The dam had broken. The wolf convulsed, and a second pup slid out, encased in a shimmering sack. Agafia tore the sack open with her fingernails. A tiny, wet squeak filled the room. This one was alive. A black male, struggling and kicking. Good boy, Agafia whispered. She placed him near the mother's head. The mother, exhausted beyond measure, lifted her head and began to lick the pup vigorously, her rough tongue stimulating his breathing. 10 minutes later, a third came. A female, silver, like her mother. Then, the labor stopped. The cabin was quiet again, save for the crackling of the fire and the wet, rhythmic sound of the mother cleaning her young. Agafia sat back on her heels, her hands covered in blood and fluids. She felt trembling in her own legs now. She looked at the scene before her. A wild timber wolf, the apex predator of the tundra, nursing 2 pups on her living room rug, while the body of a third lay cold on a towel nearby. Agafia stood up slowly, her joints popping. She picked up the stillborn pup. "I will bury him," she said softly. Even in the snow, as she moved toward the door to place the little body in the cold storage for burial later, the mother wolf let out a sharp bark. Agafia turned, tensing. The wolf wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at Agafia. She nudged the 2 living pups toward the elderly woman, then laid her head back down, her eyes closing heavily. It was a gesture of absolute trust. "You saved them. They are yours too." Agafia felt a lump form in her throat, hard and painful. She washed her hands in the basin, the water turning pink. She made herself a cup of strong black tea and sat in her rocking chair, the rifle still leaning against the wall, but forgotten. She watched them for hours. She named the mother Serafima, meaning fiery one, for the fire of life she had just fought for. But the drama wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 3 days passed. The storm raged outside, burying the cabin in 6 feet of snow. Inside, a strange domesticity had formed. Serafima was regaining her strength, eating the venison stew Agafia prepared. The pups were growing stronger, but on the 4th night, the wind died down. The silence returned, and with the silence came a sound that froze Agafia's blood. Howling, not the singular cry of a lost wolf, but the synchronized, terrifying chorus of a pack. They were close. They were right outside the cabin. Serafima's ears pricked up. She struggled to her feet, a low growl building in her throat. She wasn't growling at Agafia. She was growling at the door. Agafia went to the window and wiped away the frost. Under the light of the full moon, she saw them. 12 of them, a massive pack, encircling the cabin. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like dozens of floating lamps, and in the center stood a black wolf, scarred and missing half a tail. The Alpha. They hadn't come to rescue Serafima. Agafia realized with a jolt of horror that Serafima hadn't been lost. She had been exiled. She was an outcast, and the pack had come to finish the job. Agafia looked at Serafima, who was now standing over her pups, her hackles raised, teeth bared, ready to die to defend them. Then Agafia looked at her rifle. She had 5 bullets. There were 12 wolves. She grabbed her coat. "Not in my house," she spat. "And not on my watch." The standoff began in silence. The 12 wolves outside didn't bark. They simply stood in a semicircle, black silhouettes against the blinding white snow, their breath rising in synchronized plumes of steam. The Alpha, the massive black wolf with the mangled tail, stepped forward. He sniffed the air, smelling the blood of the birth, the scent of the pups, and the presence of the traitor, Serafima. Inside the cabin, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the roaring stove. Serafima was pacing now, a low, constant rumble in her chest. She nudged the 2 pups under Agafia's heavy iron bed frame, then positioned herself in the center of the room, facing the door. She was weak, her legs trembling from the labor, but her fangs were bared. Agafia checked the Mosin Nagant. 5 rounds. That was it. She had a box of ammo in the shed. But the shed was 20 yards away, a suicide run. "They won't attack the house," Agafia whispered, trying to convince herself. "They are afraid of fire. They are afraid of man." But deep down, she knew this pack was different. They were desperate. The winter had been too harsh. The reindeer herds had moved south. Hunger made beasts bold, but vengeance made them reckless. Suddenly, the alpha threw his head back and let out a short, sharp yip. Chaos erupted. 2 wolves broke from the pack and charged the cabin. They didn't go for the door. They went for the windows. They threw their 100-pound bodies against the heavy wooden shutters Agafia had latched shut only hours ago. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Bam! Agafia fired through the gap in the shutter. The sound of the rifle in the small space was deafening. The bullet missed the wolf but struck the frozen earth inches from its paw, sending a spray of ice shrapnel into its face. The wolf yelped and scrambled back. 1 gone. 4 left, Agafia counted, her hands shaking as she worked the bolt. The pack retreated to the tree line, realizing the den had teeth. But they didn't leave. They began to pace, circling the house, looking for weaknesses. They were testing the perimeter. Hours dragged on. The night deepened. The temperature outside dropped to -58°C. The cold was a weapon now. The wolves could survive it. They were built for it. But Agafia's firewood supply was on the porch. If she went out to get logs, she was dead. If the fire went out, the cabin would freeze within hours. Serafima seemed to understand the tactical situation. She moved to Agafia and pressed her flank against the old woman's leg. It was a gesture of solidarity. "We stand together." Around 4 a.m., the scratching started. It came from beneath the floorboards. The wolves were digging. The cabin was raised on stilts due to the permafrost, but the skirting was old timber. They were trying to come up from underneath. Agafia grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She stomped on the floor where the scratching was loudest. "Get away!" she screamed. Serafima dove at the floor, tearing at the wood planks with her claws, growling into the darkness below. A snout appeared through a rotted gap in the corner. Serafima lunged, her jaws snapping shut on the intruder's nose. A howl of pain echoed from beneath the house, followed by the sound of scrambling bodies retreating. They were safe, but only for the moment. Morning brought a pale, sickly light to the tundra, but no relief. The pack was still there, lying in the snow like gray boulders, patient and unmoving. The alpha sat right in front of the porch steps, staring at the door. He was mocking them. Then, a sound cut through the wind. A mechanical roar. Agafia rushed to the peephole. In the distance, a large, battered blue truck was bouncing over the snowdrifts. It was Victor, the mechanic. He came every Thursday to check on her and bring supplies. "Victor, no!" Agafia screamed, though he couldn't hear her. "Turn back, Victor!" Oblivious to the danger, pulled his Ural truck into the clearing. He saw the wolves and honked his horn, expecting them to scatter like stray dogs. They didn't scatter. The alpha stood up and looked at the truck. He let out a bark. The pack swarmed. They didn't attack the metal cab. They attacked the tires. With terrifying efficiency, their jaws clamped onto the thick rubber. Pop. Hiss. The truck listed to the left as the front tire shredded. Victor revved the engine, trying to reverse, but the wheels spun uselessly in the deep snow. The wolves jumped onto the hood. They were clawing at the windshield. Victor was trapped in a metal box, and the glass was beginning to crack. Agafia looked at the terrified mechanic, then at Serafima, then at the rifle. She had 4 bullets. There were still 11 wolves. One was nursing a bitten nose. She couldn't stay inside. Victor was a good man. He had a wife and a young daughter in Yakutsk. He was only here because of her. Agafia put on her fur hat. She looked at Serafima. "Stay here," she commanded. "Guard the little ones." But as Agafia slid the deadbolt back and kicked the door open, the wind howling into the warm room, she felt a heavy weight beside her. Serafima limped out onto the porch, her golden eyes fixed on the alpha. She was weak, bleeding, and exhausted, but she was a mother, and she was an alpha herself. The 2 of them, the old woman and the dying wolf, stepped out into the killing freeze to face the pack. The moment the door opened, the pack froze. They turned from the truck, their attention snapping to the porch. Victor, pale as a sheet inside the cab, stopped screaming. He watched in disbelief as the elderly widow descended the steps, rifle raised, with a massive timber wolf limping at her side like a war dog. The Black Alpha jumped down from the truck's hood. He trotted forward, ignoring Agafia entirely. His eyes were locked on Serafima. This was a challenge of leadership. By the laws of the wild, Serafima should have submitted. She was an outcast. She was weakened by birth. But Serafima didn't lower her head. She raised her hackles, making herself look twice her size. She bared her teeth and let out a roar, not a bark, but a primal, chest-deep roar that echoed off the distant mountains. It was the sound of a queen reclaiming her throne. The Black Alpha snarled and charged. "No!" Agafia shouted. She raised the rifle, aiming for the black blur moving across the snow. She pulled the trigger. Click. A misfire. The old Soviet ammo was a dud. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Agafia's chest. She worked the bolt frantically, ejecting the bad round. But it was too late. The Black Alpha collided with Serafima in an explosion of fur and teeth. The impact knocked Serafima backward into the snow. She was too weak to withstand the assault. The Black Alpha pinned her, his jaws seeking her throat. Serafima twisted, slashing at his face. But she was losing. The rest of the pack began to close in, sensing the end. Agafia didn't think. She didn't aim. She didn't breathe. She ran forward. She was 72 years old. Her joints ached, and her back was bent. But in that moment, she moved with the fury of a grizzly bear. She swung the heavy wooden stock of the Mosin Nagant like a club. Crack! The butt of the rifle connected solidly with the Black Alpha's ribs. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly loud. The Alpha yelped, a high-pitched sound of shock, and released Serafima. He spun around, snapping at Agafia. His teeth caught the sleeve of her coat, ripping through the thick wool and tearing into her forearm. Agafia screamed, falling to her knees in the snow. The Alpha loomed over her, drool dripping onto her face, ready to deliver the killing bite. Bang! The shot didn't come from Agafia. The Black Alpha's head snapped back violently. He collapsed instantly, sliding sideways into the snow, dead before he hit the ground. Agafia looked up, gasping for air, clutching her bleeding arm. Victor was leaning out of the shattered window of his truck, a smoking Makarov pistol in his hand. His hands were shaking, but his aim had been true. Silence crashed back down onto the clearing. The remaining 10 wolves stood frozen. Their leader was dead. The hierarchy was broken. They looked at the dead Alpha, then at Victor, then at Agafia. Finally, they looked at Serafima. Serafima dragged herself out of the snow. She was limping badly, blood matting her silver fur. She walked over to the body of the Black Alpha. She sniffed it once, then lifted her head and looked at the pack. She didn't growl. She simply stared at them, her golden eyes burning. She stood over Agafia, placing her body between the pack and the wounded woman. One by one, the wolves lowered their tails, their ears flattened. They were not submitting to Serafima as a leader. She was too connected to the humans now, but they were acknowledging her power. They were acknowledging that this territory, this cabin, and this human belonged to her. The beta male, a large gray wolf, gave a low whine. He turned and trotted toward the tree line. The others followed. Within seconds, they had vanished into the taiga, leaving only paw prints and blood behind. Victor scrambled out of the truck, rushing to Agafia's side. "Agafia Petrovna, my God, are you alive?" "I'm fine." Agafia wheezed, though the world was spinning. She looked at her arm. It was a bad bite, deep and jagged. Just a scratch. She reached out her good hand. Serafima lowered her massive head and licked the blood from Agafia's fingers. Agafia survived. Victor drove her to the hospital in the city, where she received 30 stitches and a round of rabies shots. When she returned home a week later, she expected the cabin to be empty. She expected Serafima to have taken her pups and returned to the wild. She was wrong. When Victor helped her up the porch steps, the door was scratched, but intact. And there, sitting on the rug by the cold stove, were 3 wolves, Serafima and her 2 pups, who were already doubling in size. They had raided the pantry for dried meat, but they hadn't left. For the next 4 years, the people of Oymyakon whispered about the Witch of the Woods. Hunters reported seeing an old woman gathering firewood in the forest, flanked by 3 massive timber wolves. They said the wolves never attacked her livestock. Instead, they chased away bears and foxes. Serafima stayed with Agafia until the end. When Agafia Petrovna finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 76, it wasn't Victor who found her first. When the villagers arrived to collect her body, they found the door open. The fire had burned out. Agafia lay peacefully in her bed. And curling around her, keeping her warm even in death, were 2 massive wolves. Serafima was gone. Wolves often go away to die when their time comes, but her children had stayed. As they carried Agafia's casket out to the truck, the villagers heard it. From the high ridge overlooking the valley, a single, mournful howl pierced the silence of the whispering stars. It was joined by another and another, until the whole valley echoed with the song of the pack. They weren't howling at the moon. They were singing her home. This story reminds us that kindness is the only universal language. In the harshest place on earth, a simple act of mercy bridged the gap between predator and prey, creating a family that defied the laws of nature. Agafia didn't just save a wolf, she saved a mother, and in return, she was never alone again. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more incredible real-life stories from around the world. What would you have done in Agafia's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.